Well, Michael Willie tried to conclude the series of episodes on Bluff Creek in 1958 with episode 11. He really tried, fellow babies, but there was just too much information to pass on. So many holes to poke in a theory to get it all into one episode.
Yeah, that's right.
But this is it, fellow babies. Today, Michael Willie will finish discussing Loren Coleman's position on Bluff Creek, and that will conclude this series of episodes.
And there was much rejoicing.
So hang on tight, fellow babies. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Good morning, fellow babies. A great day in store for you here in the metro area.
But the senator, while insisting he was not intoxicated, could not explain his nudity.
For hundreds of years, people from all walks of life have reported sightings of a large hairy animal walking on 2 feet. The scientific community has dismissed these sightings as hoaxes, hallucinations, or misidentified bears. But is there another option? Is it possible that there is an ape, the largest of the great apes, unrecognized and unclassified by modern science, roaming the forest of North America? Please join us as we seek the answer to this compelling question. You have arrived at the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Hey, fellow babies! Welcome to Bigfoot Crossing, the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. I'm Michael Willie, your guide on this ongoing expedition. Thanks so much for being with us here today at Bigfoot Crossing. Now, today we are going to continue and finalize our discussion of the aftermath of that watershed foundational event in the history of Bigfoot, the publication in the Humboldt Times of the article about Jerry Crew's discovery of and casting of gigantic human-like footprints near Bluff Creek in Northern California, and the subsequent spread of that article across the country as a result of being picked up by the wire services. October 6th, 1958, a very slow news day, part 6. And we'll complete this series of episodes by concluding our discussion of Loren Coleman's position on this issue, as set forth in his otherwise excellent book, Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America, and his 1995 article that was written for the journal The Anomalist, entitled, Was the First Bigfoot a Hoax? Cryptozoology's Original Sin. And class is in session. As we mentioned at the end of the last episode, there is one other item to examine in Loren Coleman's Ray Wallace faked the footprints at Bluff Creek theory. And that item is what Loren calls Ray Wallace's confession. All right, fellow babies, let's jump right in. Now, Jim McLaren was a Bigfoot researcher who was closely associated with John Green, and Jim briefly put out a publication called the Manimals Newsletter. Ray Wallace was a prolific letter writer from the 60s through the 80s. To give you an example, in the Greenboro News and Record article that we discussed in an earlier episode, and that is available online and is listed in the bibliography on the episode info page, Mark Chorvinsky, editor of Strange Magazine and a longtime Bigfoot skeptic, says he received hundreds of pages of correspondence from Ray Wallace over the years. And if you would like to read some excerpts from some of Ray's letters, John Green included a few in his final publication, The Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot, at pages 12 and 13. Now, by way of reminder, The Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot is available for purchase at HancockHouse.com and at the Bigfoot Crossing web store with that special discount for podcast listeners. Be sure to use the BFC15 coupon code.
Shameless plug.
Lauren Coleman zeroes in on a letter that Ray Wallace sent to Jim McLaren and claims that Ray confessed to faking tracks at Bluff Creek in 1958 in this letter. But I'll be reading from pages 76 and 77 of Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. Now, the letter is full of spelling and grammatical errors, so bear with me as I try to read it verbatim. In the letter, Ray writes, quote, "When I was building a road on Bluff Creek," now that's a typographical error there. He misspells Bluff Creek. "When I was building a road on Bluff Creek, this one old Bigfoot used to peer from behind those giant fir trees and watch my bulldozers build road up the rough terrain along Bluff Creek. When the bear hunters came into the Bluff Creek area to chase the Bigfoot with their hounds, we never saw Bigfoot anymore. After this had went on for about 2 months. I told some bear hunters that I was making those big tracks. They asked to see what I was using to make them with. When I couldn't show them anything, they kept right on chasing the Bigfoot with their hounds, which really made me mad. I had some Indians working there for me, and they told me many stories about the Indian devil during the noontime, about how he wasn't mean anymore. I could see that the bear hunters wasn't going to stop chasing the Bigfoot unless I could show them how I was making the tracks. So I wrote a letter to a friend of mine who used to build donkey sleds and heel loading booms that we used in our logging operations while we were in Oregon. This was a professional broadaxe man. In his younger years, he used to hew boomsticks for ships, just as smooth as if they were done by machine. I told him that I wanted a set of feet hewed from some kind of soft wood so I could show the bear hunters how I was making the big tracks. I run into all kind of troubles trying to keep Bigfoot from being killed by hunters. Some of the bear hunters went to Eureka and told the sheriff that I had a pair of feet made of wood and was making Bigfoot tracks. Then the sheriff sent a deputy out to bring me into town to talk to him. I tried to get my attorney to sue Humboldt County Sheriff for $1 million damage suit, but he wouldn't, as he said the sheriff was a good friend of his. I still have the set of wooden feet that I paid $50 for, end quote. Now, in his book, Lauren doesn't give us the date of the letter, but in a footnote to the 1995 article in The Anomalist, Lauren tells us that the letter was given to him by Jim McLaren and was written either in 1969 or 70. Apparently, Ray Wallace did not always date his letters. Now, fellow babies, let's look at the bulldozer-sized holes in this quote-unquote confession. First, there's the bear hunters who came into Bluff Creek with their hounds to chase Bigfoot. It's interesting that Ray calls them bear hunters in his letter because in the October 14th, 1958 Humboldt Times article about the sheriff wanting to question Ray Wallace, Ray is quoted about the footprints as saying, quote, "I used to think they were bear tracks, and I still do," end quote. Now, fellow babies, the only hunters that are ever mentioned in any of the materials that I've researched are Ray Kerr and Bob Brazil, the hunters that Ray Wallace hired. And yes, Bob Brazil had 4 hound dogs. Now, why in the wide, wide world of sports would Ray Wallace hire hunters and then say, oh no, don't hunt Bigfoot, it's me making the footprints? He wouldn't. But Ray is not going to let the facts get in the way of a good tall tale. And yes, that wide, wild world of sports crack is a direct quote from Slim Pickens in the classic Mel Brooks movie Blazing Saddles. It is hilarious, it's irreverent, and it's largely misunderstood by today's politically correct crowd. And it's available on DVD from Amazon.
No sale.
Now, secondly, Ray's friend, the quote-unquote professional broadaxe man, who Ray asked to carve the feet, is another example of the tall tale trumping the facts. That is none other than Rant Mullins. Now remember, according to Rant Mullins, in the article in the fall 1982 issue of Skeptical Inquirer, Ray Wallace bought the wooden feet from Rant in, wait for it, 1969. 11 years too late to be used at Bluff Creek. Now, in a 1982 article in the LA Times entitled Bigfoot Legend Engenders a Feud, Ray Wallace acknowledges buying a set of carved feet from Rant Mullins for $50. Doesn't say when he did it in the article, but he does acknowledge doing that. And Rant Mullins, as I just said, stated that Ray Wallace didn't buy those feet from him until 1969. In his book, Lauren writes that Ray Wallace's, quote, save the Bigfoot rationalization appears to be an invention to put some spin on his schemes being temporarily exposed by the sheriff's office, end quote. Now, why in the wide, wide world of sports would Ray Wallace need to spin something that had happened years earlier? We're talking he's trying to spin something in 1969 that happened in 1958. Why? Well, he wouldn't do that, and besides, Ray didn't need to spin the situation. He had already handled the sheriff's office in the Humboldt Times article on October 14th, 1958, when Ray threatened to sue the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office backed down. This letter isn't a confession about Bluff Creek. In my opinion, it's an attempt to concoct a tall tale to try to explain away his purchase of a pair of wooden feet carved by Rant Mullins. No wonder Wallace tells McLaren, quote, I still have the set of feet that I paid $50 for, end quote. Of course he still had them. The wooden feet were still practically new when he wrote that letter. But at least Loren Coleman has the good grace to inform his readers that the reason Wallace wanted to save the Bigfoot is so he could, quote, follow the beasts and find the caches of gold they guard, end quote. Page 78 of Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. So, where does Ray Wallace fit in all of this? Loren Coleman on page 74 of his book states, quote, Wallace appeared, however, to be very willing to place himself in the middle of all of this, end quote. Well, Ray is the subcontractor on the job, and his employees saw the tracks, and ultimately 2 of his employees saw Bigfoot. But as Ed Schillinger, both an employee and friend of Ray Wallace, confirmed, Ray was rarely at the work site. He was the subcontractor on more than one job. Remember, Loren Coleman even acknowledges that as the Mad River work site was going on, Bluff Creek was going on. So Ray had multiple jobs going on, and plus he was out doing what contractors do, looking for future work. And when you look at Ray's comments in the various Humboldt Times articles, you don't see an attention-seeking prankster. You see an employer concerned about getting a job done, and the effect all of this is having on his contract and reputation. It is the frankly ham-handed efforts of the sheriff's office to question Ray that puts him in the middle of things temporarily. But later is a different story. John Green writes at page 14 of the Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot that sometime later Ray, quote, apparently developed a yen to share the attention Bigfoot had stirred up and began to spin his outrageous yarns. Later still, probably after he had moved back to his old home in Washington State, he began making and selling obviously fake casts. I used to see them at a lodge on Mount St. Helens, which also sold my books, end quote. Oh, yes, Ray would see the practical joke and tall tale value in Bigfoot and would milk it for all it's worth. In 1959, Ray claimed to have captured a young Bigfoot. When Tom Slick offered to buy it, Ray couldn't produce it. But Ray did help produce a country music album entitled Bigfoot, Northwest's Abominable Snowman. The photograph for the album cover was provided by Ray Wallace. It's a picture of a person in a really bad example of a Bigfoot costume sitting with a cougar. It's interesting to note that according to the LA Times obituary on Ray Wallace, in later years, Ray Wallace operated a menagerie of animals, including cougars. So the cover art could be Ray posing in a Bigfoot costume alongside one of his own cougars from the menagerie. Anyway, Ray also provided recordings of quote-unquote Bigfoot noises and screams that were used on the album. There's a music site called Discogs.com. That's Discogs.com. And that site calls the album, quote, an incredibly strange country record, end quote. I have placed a picture of the front and back of the album cover on the episode info page. Just go to bigfootcrossing.net, click on episode info at the top of the page, and then click on the link for episode 12. The LA Times obituary is also listed in the bibliography. And while you're on the website, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
In the field of visual arts, Ray claimed to have hundreds of feet of film of Bigfoot in the wild. In an excerpt of a letter to a local newspaper reproduced in John Green's book, The Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot, Ray writes of tossing apples out the window of his pickup to a waiting Bigfoot. Quote, then as he ate the apples, I would have my movie camera clipping off more footage of him. I have talked to several movie companies about selling my movies, which would last for 3 hours. The best offer I've had so far is $250,000, end quote. Now, Ray did produce films and photographs that were obvious fakes. According to a couple of articles published after Ray's death, at least one of the films featured his wife in an ape suit. Lauren Coleman at page 72 of Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America, cites Mark Chorvinsky, editor of Strange Magazine and longtime Bigfoot critic, and has this to say about Ray Wallace's films and photographs. Quote, as Chorvinsky points out in his Wallace articles, Ray Wallace said he had many films of Bigfoot which he floated around as quote-unquote new pictures of Bigfoot to various researchers until someone took the bait. For example, a dozen years ago, Wallace's alleged photos of Bigfoot looked amazingly like someone's bad idea of a version of the Patterson Bigfoot asleep on a log. It was an obvious hoax, end quote. And that's the point here, fellow babies, although Lauren Coleman insists upon missing it. Every film, every photograph, every footprint cast that Ray Wallace ever produced were obvious fakes. When Lauren Coleman first announced his Ray Wallace as Bluff Creek hoaxer theory in the 1995 Anomalist article, John Green took issue with it and submitted a rebuttal in the form of a letter to the editor of The Anomalist. Now, that rebuttal, along with Coleman's sur-rebuttal, is published in the winter 1995-96 edition of The Anomalist. That's Anomalist 3. To his credit, Coleman in his book acknowledges John Green's disagreement and quotes from Green's rebuttal on page 79 of his book. Unfortunately, Coleman again misses the excellent point that John Green makes. Green states, quote, there is, however, pretty convincing evidence that if anyone faked all those tracks at Bluff Creek in 1958, it couldn't have been Ray Wallace. The evidence for that is the pathetic quality of his repeated attempts to fake such things since that time. Or are we supposed to believe that changing from a master hoaxer into a laughingstock was all part of his ingenious plan, end quote. Indeed, if Ray Wallace was the mastermind behind an elaborate and convincing hoax at Bluff Creek in 1958, he clearly lost his mojo in the following years. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, well, if Ray Wallace didn't make the tracks, maybe his brother Wilbur did, either on his own or at Ray's behest. Lauren Coleman questions the role that Wilbur, a.k.a. Shorty, played in these events, stating at page 74 of his book, quote, likewise, it is Wilbur who is the source of the tales of the huge oil drums and truck tires being tossed around, end quote. And that's a valid point and a valid question. But it makes no sense for Wilbur to be either the accomplice or the main culprit in a hoax at Bluff Creek for all the reasons that we've discussed. Ray and Shorty's livelihoods, and indeed the livelihoods of all of the Wallace brothers, and their ability to put food on the table for their families depended upon the success of Wallace Brothers construction. That point is borne out early on when Wilbur is informed of the barrel of fuel being found in a gully. Marion T. Place recounts, beginning at page 32 of On the Track of Bigfoot, how the mechanic finds the fuel drum at the bottom of a gully and tells Wilbur about it. Wilbur questions the mechanic's sobriety, and the mechanic, quote, urged Wallace to come see for himself. Wallace did and ended up being completely mystified too. After thinking it over, he asked the mechanic not to talk about it. He didn't want any of the workers imagining that a monster was prowling the area because some would walk off the job right then and there. If too many quit, the project would have to shut down and everybody would be out of work. Since the mechanic wanted to keep on working, he said nothing more, end quote. Now, everybody being out of work included Wilbur. And so Wilbur created the vandals excuse to placate the crew. However, Jerry Crew's reporting on his track find in front of the assembled workers forced Wilbur's hand, and he had to tell the workers that vandals were not to blame for the fuel drum or the tire or the section of culvert that were all found at the bottom of gullies. The question is asked then, if not vandals, then who is to blame? And Mrs. Place reports that, quote, the foreman grinned and shrugged his shoulders, and after some additional discussion, asked the men to get to work. Now, I think these items, these reports of items being moved around are not stories concocted by Wilbur and Ray to get men to quit, but they are actual events that happened. And the story that Wilbur actually does concoct is the one about vandals moving around these various items, and he does that to keep the men from quitting and slowing the work down. And I think that because of two other occurrences that we don't learn about from Shorty Wallace, but from two other sources, and the first one is Jerry Crew himself. As I mentioned earlier, on October 26, 1977, the Humboldt Times published a front-page article on Jerry Crew, complete with an updated picture of Jerry holding one of his Bigfoot casts. The article states, quote, I can't imagine the strength of the creature, said Crew, and told of logging a camp equipment tumbled about 50-gallon barrels of diesel fuel thrown around and 1,600 pounds of trailer upended as the creature was apparently looking for something, end quote. Either Jerry continued working on the Bluff Creek project after 1958, or else he stayed in contact with folks who did, as this incident with the trailer occurred in 1963. In his book, On the Track of the Sasquatch, John Green confirmed the incident took place as Jerry described it by interviewing in 1967 4 men who had been a part of the crew. At page 44 of the 1973 edition, John Green relates that a loud crashing noise was heard around 10 a.m. during the workday. Later, it was found that the noise had been caused by a trailer load of culverts being flipped over during the workday. John Green writes, quote, "They said it took half a dozen men to tip the load enough so that the chains holding the culvert to the trailer could be released," end quote. That's from page 45 of the 1973 edition, On the Track of the Sasquatch, which is out of print as an individual title. However, it has been reprinted as part of John Green's last book, The Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot, which is available for purchase at HancockHouse.com and in the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug. Sorry.
Now, if it took 6 men to just tip the load so they could reach the chains to release the load, how many men would it have taken to flip an entire trailer load of culverts? And I'll say it again, during the workday.
Wow.
The other occurrence is recorded in Jeff Meldrum's book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, and Meldrum writes there, quote, "Given the remote location, the recurring enormous tracks were a bit unnerving even for the intrepid road crew. When Wilbur Shorty Wallace, Ray's brother, reported finding heavy equipment moved about, 50-gallon drums of diesel fuel, 700-pound spare tires, large steel culverts, tossed about without explanation other than the associated giant footprints, the crew became even more disconcerted. Was Shorty just having fun with the men? Ed Patrick didn't think that this was the case," end quote. Now, Ed Patrick, who was a member of the original Pacific Northwest expedition formed by Tom Slick, he describes to Meldrum how loads of steel culverts were delivered to the site in 4s, 4 to a trailer, and held in place on the trailer with a heavy gauge wire cable about 3/16 of an inch thick. When the cable was cut loose, it was coiled up and left on the ground until it could be hauled away. The coil of cable weighed over 100 pounds. Ed Patrick told Jeff Meldrum that he and Bob Titmus were, quote, "scouting for sign of the track maker up the mountain above the construction camp when they came upon one of these unwieldy bundles of cable which had been carried a considerable distance up the mountainside off-road." Patrick, who was initially skeptical about the whole affair, couldn't imagine why anyone would have hauled that heavy bundle through the rough, steep terrain to such an out-of-the-way location, even if someone were capable of doing it, end quote. Again, that's a quote from page 56 of Jeff Meldrum's excellent book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which is available at Amazon.com.
No sale.
So Shorty Wallace's accounts of equipment being moved around are corroborated by these accounts from Jerry Crew, John Green, and Ed Patrick. Wilbur Shorty Wallace was neither an accomplice nor the chief culprit in an alleged hoax at Bluff Creek. So, fellow babies, we have examined the claims of the Wallace family. We've examined the claims of Loren Coleman. We've weighed the evidence, and based upon what we know about the work site and the evidence presented by the investigators on the ground, I can wholeheartedly say that the claims of both the Wallace family and Loren Coleman are meritless. Now remember, even though I believe the Bluff Creek tracks to be genuine, I can't say for a fact, 65 years removed from the event, that the tracks weren't somehow faked by somebody. And while I can't 100% rule out Ray Wallace as a suspect, based upon what we've learned, I think we can agree that the preponderance of the evidence weighs against Ray Wallace faking those footprints at Bluff Creek. And we can say that the preponderance of the evidence weighs against the tracks having been faked in the way that either the Wallace family or Loren Coleman says they were faked.
Hello, mate. That's right.
But before we go, let's put 3 nails in the coffin holding the Ray Wallace was a hoaxer theory. The first nail is the matter of a reward that was offered by the Willow Creek China Flat Museum.
A reward?
Yes, a reward. In the aftermath of the Wallace family announcement that Ray Wallace had faked the footprints at Bluff Creek, the museum offered a reward of $100,000 to anyone who could demonstrate how the Bluff Creek tracks could have been made by a human. Now, the text of the reward is reprinted in John Green's book, The Best of Sasquatch Bigfoot, at page 16. And I'll read from portions of the reward announcement.
Quote,
$100,000 is being offered by the Willow Creek China Flat Museum for anyone who can demonstrate how the Bigfoot tracks that were observed in the Bluff Creek Valley in Northern California in 1958 and later could have been made by a human or humans. The offer is genuine. It is not a joke or a publicity stunt. The money has been arranged for, and the first person or group who can meet the conditions of the offer will receive it. Everyone should understand, however, that the conditions are not easy. The offer is a direct result of recent publicity which has created the perception that the Bluff Creek tracks were just a hoax carried out by a practical joker walking around wearing a large pair of carved wooden feet. But it is not meant as a challenge to the people who originated that story, who may well be perfectly sincere. The offer also is not a prize for technological achievement, such as being the first to build an effective footprint stomping machine. It relates entirely to the question of whether the real tracks which brought the Bigfoot phenomenon to public attention could have been made by humans under the real conditions of the times and the places in which they appeared. The museum has casts of some of the tracks concerned, a few of them copies, but mainly original, available for inspection. It also has some related photographs and published accounts of what was done and observed in connection with the tracks. There are also people still available for consultation who studied the tracks when they were made. Continuing on, a formal document setting out the requirements to qualify for the award will take time to prepare, but a successful applicant will have to be able to make flat-footed, human-like footprints with more than twice the area of human feet and longer than human strides, which do the following: traverse a wide variety of terrains, including climbing, descending, and crossing steep slopes covered with underbrush, show variations of shape and toe position and stride accommodating to the terrain, sink into firm ground to far greater depth than human footprints, specifically as much as an inch deep in hard sand where humans barely penetrate at all. Leave hard objects in the ground, such as stones, sticking up above the track. The applicant will also have to be able to make these tracks under the following conditions, although not all in combination: in the dark, hundreds in a single night, in places where it is impossible to bring any vehicle or any machine or any equipment except what humans or animals could carry, without doing anything to attract the notice of people a few hundred yards away. Now, fellow babies, this $100,000 reward was offered for a number of years. And you want to hear a surprise? No one, not any member of the Wallace family, not Lauren Coleman, not Mark Chervinsky, no one attempted to claim the reward. The museum confirmed to me that the reward offer was withdrawn when John Green died, as he was the person funding the offer. But during the time when the reward offer was extended, which was from 2002 to 2016, no one, fellow babies, no one even tried to claim it. No one was willing to put their money where their mouth is and test their theory as to how these tracks had been allegedly faked. By the way, I have placed a link to the website for the Willow Creek China Flat Museum on the episode info page. And in 2016, on the Bigfoot Crossing radio program, I did an episode on the Willow Creek China Flat Museum, and Mrs. Peggy McWilliams, a lovely lady who is a docent at the museum, was a guest on the show. And that episode is archived on the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/@BFC podcast. The links are on the Bigfoot Crossing website, bigfootcrossing.net. And while you're there on the website, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Now, the second nail in the coffin comes from who else but our intrepid girl reporter, Betty Allen. Betty's article, Bigfoot Still on March as Experts Try Explanations, appeared in the October 31st edition, the October 31st, 1958 edition of the Humboldt Times. And once again, Betty is at the Bluff Creek worksite examining footprint tracks. Betty writes that those who think there is a hoax going on say, quote, that the tracks are made by spacing carved feet a certain distance apart on the treads of a tractor or on a roller used to smooth the road. Is that possible? End quote. Now let's pause here and point out that using motorized equipment to make the tracks would not have worked at Bluff Creek because, as we've learned, the crew was living right down the road and would have come to investigate the noise. But Betty debunks this hoax explanation with the physical evidence at the worksite. Betty continues, quote, individual measurements show some tracks to be 60 inches apart, some 52 inches, and others at 40 inches apart. Sometimes the tracks step easily up or down the rough terrain. It is not necessarily in the path of a roller. In other places, the tracks are within inches of the edge of the road, in others varying distances from the oiler rig or trucks, end quote. So what Betty is saying here is that the theory that the carved feet are attached to the treads of a tractor or on a roller cannot account for the variation in the length of the stride and the variation in the distances between the tracks and the objects the tracks walk around. The hoax theory fails. But our intrepid girl reporter isn't finished yet. Betty writes, quote, the case of the wooden feet that they say are in existence. If true, they must be magnificent models of workmanship. Each toe is separate. Tiny lines of the human foot are visible. Then one asks if the toes are hinged to give the startling realism of action observed in the big tracks. There are those who answer with a yes, end quote. Now, fellow babies, when the implications of what Betty is saying here sunk in, I was frankly gobsmacked. Now, Betty's language isn't as clear as I would like, but the phrase tiny lines of the human foot are visible seems to be a direct reference to being able to see dermal ridges in the footprints in the soil at Bluff Creek. And the comment about the startling realism of action observed in the big tracks is absolutely a clear reference to individual toe movement in the footprints. These footprints were not made by static wooden feet strapped to a person's boot or attached to a piece of machinery or hoisted up by cables. These prints were made by a living creature whose toes moved and shifted position with each step and who may have left dermal ridge evidence in those dusty footprints. Once again, the hoax theory fails. The final nail in the coffin of the hoax theory comes to us via Jeff Meldrum's book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. On page 64, Dr. Meldrum writes about Dr. Maurice Tripp, a geologist and geophysicist from San Jose, California. Dr. Tripp examined and cast footprints at Bluff Creek. And based upon his engineering studies of the soil properties and the depth of the track, Dr. Tripp said that the track maker would weigh in excess of 800 pounds. Now, Dr. Tripp didn't rule out the possibility of a hoax, but did say, quote, it would be difficult to fraudulently prepare hundreds of such tracks overnight, particularly in the type of country in which they were found, end quote. Now, let's do a little math here. Just a little math, because math is not my forte. If it were, I'd be an accountant and I'd be making real money. Dr. Tripp says that the weight of the track maker was in excess of 800 pounds. That means that if a 200-pound man were tromping around the Bluff Creek site at night wearing false feet, that 200-pound man would have to be carrying at least 600 pounds of weight on his back in order to have made those prints.
What?
It also means that in order to fake footprints using weighted false feet, that person would have to schlep around 800 pounds of weight in the dark in a wilderness. Either way, simply impossible.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, I did a Google search for Dr. Tripp and found a reprint of an article that appeared in the San Jose News in 1958 or 1959 regarding Dr. Tripp's efforts in Bluff Creek. A link to that article is on the episode info page. I also found that Dr. Tripp is mentioned in a Rolling Stone magazine article.
Oh, really? That's right, baby.
The May 10th, 1973 issue to be exact, with a very young Alice Cooper on the cover. This issue of Rolling Stone contains an article by Tim Cahill entitled Giant Apes in the North Woods, a Bigfoot Study. For the most part, it's a fairly straightforward article on Bigfoot history and sightings and hits all the high points like Bluff Creek in 1958, the Patterson-Gimlin film in 1967. I enjoyed the article right up to the end when Cahill now announces an exclusive interview with Bigfoot, who it turns out is looking for a part in the next Planet of the Apes movies.
Really?
The original movies from the 70s, kiddos. Not the CGI extravaganzas that Hollywood's turning out today. I placed a link to the article on the episode info page. Now, in the discussion of Bluff Creek in 1958, Cahill mentions Dr. Tripp and states that the footprint cast, quote, proved that the toes showed mechanical function, meaning that the footprint cast revealed movement of the toes from step to step. Cahill also states in the article that none of Dr. Tripp's casts, quote, showed impact ridges, which would have indicated that they were made by some kind of mechanical stomping machine, end quote. Now, these two comments about the toe movement and the lack of impact ridges are not found in the article in the San Jose News, nor does Dr. Meldrum mention them in his book. It sounds like Cahill, the author of the article, spoke directly to Dr. Tripp, but I can't confirm that. So I can't vouch for the accuracy of those statements, but I will point out that they are in accord with Betty Allen's own observations of the Bluff Creek footprints. Dr. Tripp is referenced in Bigfoot researcher Christopher Murphy's website, as well as Chris's book Meet the Sasquatch and its sequel and update, Know the Sasquatch Bigfoot. I've placed a link to Christopher's website on the episode info page, and both of these fine books are available for purchase at HancockHouse.com and at the Bigfoot Crossing web store with a special discount for podcast listeners. Be sure to use that BFC15 coupon code when checking out.
Ooh, shameless plug.
Now, fellow babies, I just want to pause here for a minute and point something out. Loren Coleman's article on Bluff Creek was published in 1995. His book, Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America, complete with a chapter on Bluff Creek, was published in 2003. Nearly all of the research items that I have used to debunk Coleman's assertion that Ray Wallace faked the footprints at the Bluff Creek worksite were available well in advance of 1995. All of the Humboldt Times articles were from 1958. Ivan Sanderson's book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Comes to Life, was published in 1961. Dr. Tripp's work in the Bluff Creek area was in the papers in 1958 or 59 and was also mentioned in the Rolling Stone article in 1973. The article from the San Jose Mercury News is reprinted on the website bigfootencounters.com. And the website credits John Green with providing the website with a copy of the article. The date December 31st, 2002 is listed directly under that attribution, but it is not clear if that's the date on which John Green provided the article or the date on which it was uploaded to the website. John Green's book, On the Track of the Sasquatch, was originally published in 1968. Now, fellow babies, all I'm saying here is that virtually all of the books and articles that I relied on were available to Loren Coleman in the period in which he was researching and writing the article in The Anomalist, and then later when he was writing his book, Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. If I could find them, so could Loren Coleman. Now, I completely understand when someone puts forth a theory that is debunked or disproven by later research and investigation. But Loren Coleman insisted on advancing a theory that was quite literally debunked in the 1960s before he ever put pen to paper for the 1995 article in The Anomalist. And it seems to me if a person had information that contradicted the statements made by Ivan Sanderson and John Green and Betty Allen, it would be important to include that information in your article or in your book. But Loren Coleman doesn't address the Ivan Sanderson, Betty Allen resolution to the Ray Wallace contract question from 1961, nor does Coleman address John Green's comments on the lack of high lead logging at Bluff Creek from 1968. Now, of course, On the Track of the Sasquatch was not on Coleman's list of research resources. All right, fellow babies, I am adding a last-minute section here to this podcast for your listening pleasure because as I was doing post-production work on this episode, I realized that I had been assuming this whole time that since Loren Coleman did not list John Green's book On the Track of the Sasquatch as a research resource for the article in The Anomalist, I was assuming that Loren also didn't utilize John Green's book for Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. And I was looking at the bibliography for another book, and it dawned on me that I had never checked the bibliography for Loren Coleman's book. And you know what I found?
What?
On the Track of the Sasquatch is listed in the bibliography for Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America.
What does it mean?
Well, for one thing, it means that I was right about Loren Coleman owning a copy. I mean, there really wasn't ever a question about that, really. John Green, during his career, was the foremost chronicler of all things Bigfoot, and nearly 9 years after his death, John Green's influence remains. So any cryptozoologist is going to have at least one copy of each of John Green's books. I mean, I'm not a cryptozoologist, and I don't even play one on TV. But I have 3 copies of On the Track of the Sasquatch, and 2 copies of Sasquatch the Apes Among Us.
Does it change anything?
Only to the extent that we now have confirmation that just like Loren Coleman ignored Betty Allen's resolution of the question about Ray Wallace's contract, in Abominable Snowmen Legend Come to Life, Loren seems to be actively ignoring John Green's confirmation that high lead logging was not in use at Bluff Creek until 1963. I still have no idea why Loren Coleman would continue to push a theory to advance a narrative that was completely debunked nearly 30 years before he ever proposed it. That, my friends, is a mystery. Now back to your originally recorded podcast. And in what I consider the height of irony or maybe chutzpah, Loren Coleman states on page 25 of his article in The Anomalist, quote, "Now, 36 years later, with all the facts seemingly falling into place, it is apparent that the investigative ball was dropped in 1958, end quote. The problem here, fellow babies, is that Loren Coleman doesn't provide us with any facts. There's rumor, there's innuendo, there's speculation, hearsay, and a failure to conduct proper research, but no facts. That, fellow babies, is a textbook example of dropping the investigative ball. In the best of Sasquatch Bigfoot, without mentioning Loren Coleman by name, John Green addresses this question of dropping the investigative ball. At page 13, John Green states, quote, Ray did have quite a reputation as a practical joker. Speculation that he had a hand or foot in making the tracks surfaced early on and was by no means ignored, but on investigation was dismissed as being impossible and silly. And fellow babies, I think that we can agree that the idea of Ray Wallace perpetrating a hoax at Bluff Creek is, as John Green said, impossible and silly. In my opinion, those footprints were made by a living, breathing creature, and since October 6th, 1958, which was a very slow news day, people in America and all over the world have called that creature Bigfoot. And every Bigfoot researcher owes a huge debt of gratitude to Jerry Crew for his foresight in making plaster casts of the footprints and his courage to go on record about it and weather the storm of ridicule that he encountered. Thank you, Jerry. All right, fellow babies, that's another episode in the can. I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to Lauren in the Public Reference Department of the Humboldt County Public Library. Lauren did a great job of tracking down articles for me in the library's microfilm archives of the Humboldt Times. And these episodes would not have been possible without Lauren's work and research. And a big thanks also to my good friends Daryl Williams, Kelly Burns, Alan Duffy, and his better half, Ellie Duffy, for their voice work in today's episode. All right, fellow babies, one final additional recording to insert into this episode. And this episode is dedicated to the memory of my dear friend Alan Duffy, who quite unexpectedly passed from this life on March 10th, 2025. Alan was a true friend, a talented writer, a talented artist, a colleague, a talented voiceover artist who contributed to the Bigfoot Crossing podcast, and a generous soul. I miss you, my friend. Rest easy. Now be sure to join us right here at Bigfoot Crossing for our next episode. There's the bell, fellow babies. Thanks so much for being with us here today at Bigfoot Crossing. Now get out of here.
We hope you have enjoyed your visit with us here at Bigfoot Crossing. The internet home for Bigfoot Crossing can be found at www.bigfootcrossing.net. Michael Willie's website, Bigfoot in Tennessee, can be found at www.tnbigfoot.net. Please follow us on Facebook at Bigfoot Tennessee. You can also follow Michael Willie on Twitter. His handle is at Michael B. Willie. Each episode of Bigfoot Crossing is posted to the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel. Please subscribe so you can be notified when new episodes are posted. Your feedback is always welcome. Please email questions and comments to tnsasquatch@gmail.com. Be sure to let us know which episode you have a question or comment about. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here at Bigfoot Crossing.
This is Brock Whitmore, live on the scene. Sir, did you see what happened?
Yeah, did.